management. Before entering academia, Sony worked across various industries, including chemicals, commodities trading, social impact bonds, and as a consultant for auto component manufacturers in India. She's a very active researcher. Okay, so a couple of her recent, publications are in Journal of International Business Studies, Global Strategy Journal, etc. So I welcome Professor Jha for. Please, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. So, social network analysis, when they asked me to do a workshop on that, I was really happy because that's an area of passion for me. And you'll know why when I start teaching this topic. It is very intuitive, it is very visual, and it is also extremely helpful in your day-to-day life. Although I research mostly at the macro level, which means sometimes you'll find it difficult to connect it to your daily life, but I'm sure once you know the concepts, you will have that opportunity to do it for yourself. Yeah. So to begin with, what is a network? At the very basic level, a network is a graph of nodes, actors, or you can also call them actors or vertices. Those are connected via edges, which can be relationships or links. In this example that I have here, you'll see that each person is a node, and the white dotted line, that is an edge or a connection, right? And this is a network of mutual friends on any social media. It can be LinkedIn, it can be Instagram, it can be Facebook, anything. So it looks something like this, right? But how did social networks start? So every superhero in Marvel movie has an origin story, right? And so this is the origin story of social networks. So in 1967, Milgram, who was a professor in the US, he did this experiment. He wanted to measure the distance between two people who were not connected to each other directly. And so what he did was he passed them out really small envelopes, and basically he said that you cannot directly post to this other person. You can only send this envelope to someone you know, right? And he wanted to see, does this envelope eventually reach the intended person, right? So for example, my name is Sony, and he gives me an envelope to reach it to Donald Trump. And so I cannot post it directly to Donald Trump, but I can post it to someone I know, and then that person can post it to someone they know, and then so on and so forth. And eventually, with the goal being that you are choosing a person who you think is likely to get to a person who knows Donald Trump, right? And so that's how this experiment was conducted. And what he actually found was that a bulk of those letters indeed found their way to the intended recipients, right? Which is so fascinating, right? I mean, I'm not connected to Donald Trump for all I know. I mean, I don't know if in the last Janma I was connected to him or like something like that, but in this incarnation, I'm not. And imagine like me getting an envelope and that getting to Donald Trump. That's a pretty big deal, right? And so he created this concept known as the 6 degrees of separation, right? And so what he eventually wanted to also capture by tracing the movement of those envelopes between different people was, how does information flow among people, right? So envelope is sort of like an information packet, right, if you will. And so how does it pass on from one individual to another, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing that he found was that on an average, and this is not, average is an average, right? It is not an actual number. You have like different people reaching to different intended recipients in different kinds of steps, but on an average, it took about 6 links or 6 times the envelope was passed around to reach the intended recipient. And that's where this notion of 6 degrees of separation came in. So any two people on earth are connected to each other through 6 degrees of separation. And here I have an article from Garden where they talk about this research that Microsoft did in the US. They analyzed about 30 billion email messages to find out how much time it took for them to reach 2 unconnected people. And it was 6.6. right? Which is near about 6, well, closer to 7, but um, reaffirms the 6 degrees of separation. Now, why study social network analysis at all? So it is fascinating for sure, right? And it was an interesting exercise in how you can reach different people and so on and so forth. But what does it have to do with research, right? That is an important question. End of the day, this is a research seminar. And so the reason we study social networks is because our connections or the patterns of relationships in which we are embedded impacts the information we can access and the opportunities that are available to us, right? For example, I remember as a kid, I'm from a really small town in Madhubani, Bihar. Not even the town, I'm actually from like a rural part of that district. And for the longest time, I never knew there was a whole world outside. But my parents were academics, right? And so somehow through the academic circles, they realized there is this boarding school in Rajasthan. And my father was really scared for me because I'm a daughter. And he wanted me to send to a good school, but end of the day, he wanted it to be an exclusively girls' school. And so he found this information, and that became a game changer for me, right? He ended up sending me to that school. I received a world-class education, and I went on to do really great things in life. But had it not been for that simple information that there is a school like that, my father wouldn't have taken the decision to send me outside where I was from to study. And none of what I've done might have happened, right? I would still have been happy, I'm sure, but information is power, right? It gives you not only the knowledge about the opportunities that are immediately around you, but also opportunities that might exist outside your surroundings. So these relationships are extremely powerful. Sometimes they also shape the resource context in which you are embedded, which means that when I went to really, really good schools, either in India or in the US, what was demarcating for me was that these schools also tended to have a lot of resources, which means they had a lot of research budget that facilitated conference travels for me or purchase of data sets for me or things like that, right? And so the resource context also shapes a lot of the work that you are able to do. A lot of my own research actually is happening. You'll see it in a couple of years, not because I own those data sets or I own any of those key resources used for those papers, but simply because I know a co-author who does. Right? So the resource context is also shaped by the people you know, and connections can be extremely powerful in that sense also. So there is information, there is resources. What else, right? So, have you ever heard that saying that the people you hang out with, you start looking extremely similar to them? Right? So that's another thing, right? So the people you hang out with, the environments that you hang out in, or the environments that within which you are embedded, that also shapes your mindset around a lot of things, right? One of the things that I find very interesting when I meet students from across different schools is that there is this, if you go to a really good school, sometimes the students are not drastically different, like they are also students just like you and me, but what differentiates them is that they have a lot of confidence, right? They think anything is possible. They are willing to take a lot of risks because they really believe in themselves, right? And that mindset is shaped by the environment in which they are, because everyone starts believing in that oh, anything is possible fallacy, then actually it comes true, right? So if you don't take risks, you can end up not taking a lot of opportunities in life. And so that mindset is also really important. What is interesting here, however, is that all these things that I just talked about at the individual level also happens at the level of the firms or at the level of the countries, which is so fascinating. And the reason possibly is that even though we are talking about really macro phenomenon like countries or firms, these are also constituted by people, right? Like you and me. And so we collectively start shaping these macro level organisms in some sense of the word. So what is human in nature eventually manifests itself as at different levels. Now, one way that you usually start off in social network analysis is visualization. And network visualization is really key to anything that you do in social networks. And what is visualization? Visualization is simply a depiction of the pattern of connections and relationships amongst nodes through edges, right? So this photograph that we saw here, what is this? This is simply a network visualization of how these individuals are connected to each other through those dotted lines, right? So this is one kind of network visualization that we have here. But then there are other kinds also. One thing that I would also like to note here is that when you have a link between two individuals, whether it be people, humans, or like firms or countries, it also depicts the possibility of interaction or an actual interaction, right? So in that sense, these connections not only represent how these people are connected to each other, but they are also exemplars of how the interactions might occur or are occurring through these networks. If I don't know you, I possibly have never talked to you. And if I've talked to you, then I know you, right? So there's that corollary to remember. Now, I will give you examples of networks in different contexts. And the one that I find really fascinating, and I hope someone in the audience adapts it to the Indian context, is the Bacon number. So Kevin Bacon is a very prolific artist in the US, and he has worked across different movies. I'm sure if you Google him, it is possible you might have seen a movie or two in which he acted. He's not a leading actor, or some movies he's been possibly, but he's not a known leading actor. But he's a prolific actor, like who has done a lot of character roles or like good parts in different movies. And so what Bacon number does is that any other actor in the US, how many steps can he reach Kevin Bacon in, right? Through people they have worked with in common movies. Let's say I'm an actress, I'm not, far from it. But if I was an actress in the US, do I know someone who might know Kevin Bacon? And if I do the same Milgram experiment here, then the number that I come up with will be the Bacon number. Let's say I know someone who worked with Kevin Bacon in a movie, then my number would be one. Like I know one acquaintance who directly knows Kevin Bacon, and so on and so forth, right? If I know one person who knows another person who directly worked with Kevin Bacon, then my number would be two. If I know someone who knows someone who in turn knows someone who worked with Kevin Bacon directly, then my number would be three, so on and so forth. I have a feeling, we can come up with a Amitabh Bachchan number also, like the Bacon number, because Amitabh Bachchan is also a really prolific actor. But feel free to take any other actor and do the same exercise. Now, we talked about the actors network and how people are connected to the movies that they have worked in together. Similarly, you will have country networks. This is an example from my own research where I work on foreign direct investments. And in this network, you have different countries that are connected to each other if they have invested in each other. And what is interesting is that this is a weighted network, which means that if there is a country that shows up in a really big font, it means that it has a lot of connections. Like these are like the popular countries. So imagine a school and like you have different people in school. Some will have fewer friends, some will have a lot of friends. And so if you mapped it out and you weighted those labels or labels of students in that school, then that would be something like this, right? And the popular kids would be in big fonts and less popular kids would be in the small fonts. I would probably have been like in one of the smallest fonts on this picture. How about firm networks, right? So similar to individual networks or country networks, you might also have firm networks. This is also from my research. And how are two companies connected here? They're connected here if they share a common supplier, right? And so if I have a company that makes cars and there is a tire and we have the same supplier, like same tire supplier with another company, then I'm connected to that company, right? And so that network looks something like this. And so in this network, again, if I share a lot of common suppliers with another company or a lot of other companies, then I look really big in the font here. So there are different types of connectivity, and one thing that I would want you to remember is that what you end up using actually then depends on the academic discipline that you are in a lot of the times, right? So number one, you have connectedness or fragmentation of components. This is a very core area of research in physics. This is where the small world properties and the scale-free networks and the power law distribution was discovered. What connected components means is that if I took the entire universe of I and Rachi and I started mapping connections between individuals, and there should be no one in this network who doesn't know anyone in the core network, then it is, and everyone is connected to everyone else, let's say through a common interaction, then that would be a connected component. If there is indeed an individual at IIM branch who has never interacted with anyone, and let's say I'm a cook in the mess and I'm really introverted and I've never really interacted with anyone at I'm Ranchi, then I'll be a small thought outside that connected component, and that will be not counted in that connected component. It is a really technical thing, which we don't come across a lot in the management fields, but this is where a lot of the research on social networks started, and so a lot of the physicists work on these connected components and fragmentation and these issues. At the broad level, it refers to the topological properties of the network, which is a domain of physicists again. At the second level, you will have centrality. This is where the bulk of the research is. This is where, if you possibly take up this research, you'll end up working on. And basically, centrality is of different kinds. You can simply be interested in how many people I know, let's say directly within the research field of strategy or IB. And if, let's say, I know 5 people, that would be my degree centrality. Sometimes you would be interested also in the influence I exert, let's say, and how do you measure influence? So you measure influence by counting the number of people I know and then counting the number of people they know. Typically, really big authors within different academic disciplines, and that's not just management or international business, but really across, they tend to also know a lot of people, right? And so if I am connected to people who know a lot of different people, then possibly those are influential people themselves, and because I'm connected to them, I am considered influential in the network, right? And so on and so forth. There are multiple other measures of connectedness or centrality that you can use for different things, 2 of which we talked about. Then you have clustering. Clustering is cliquish behavior. Now imagine 2 different worlds. One is a caveman. Let's say all of the humanity ended up living in caves. So how it happens is that you know everyone within one cave, but you don't know anyone outside your cave, right? And so you are highly clustered within, but you're not clustered outside, right? And so you will have really high clustering coefficient, but really long average path lengths, right? So clustering is typically used to measure cliquish behavior. So everyone knows everyone within that cluster and no one outside. That's an extreme example of cliquish behavior. Typically in real life, you'll have an above average number of people you know within the clique, but you would also know few people outside the clique or the group that you are part of, right? And so I gave you an extreme example of the caveman world where everyone knows everyone within the cave and then absolutely no one outside the cave, but that doesn't happen in real life. It is possible that when you go out hunting or gathering fruits or berries, and I'm imagining we are all in the Stone Age, which we are not, then you might come across someone who is hunting with you together, and then you get to know people from their cave. And because you get to know that person, your people within your cave might end up getting information about what's happening in the next cave, right? That's a more real life scenario that happens. This is typically the domain of a lot of like upcoming research in the management field where they are wanting to study strategic groups or strategic group behaviors. The thought behind it being is that industry is a really vast characterization of affiliation of firms. And imagine if I'm taking the smartphone industry, and it came to my mind because we are in India, which is like the largest or the fastest growing smartphone market in the world, and you have two different companies at very two ends of the spectrum. You have Apple making extremely premium products, and hypothetically, let's say we have Freedom Mobile, which sells smartphones for as less as like 500 rupees, right? So Apple is not going to consider Freedom Mobile a competitor because they have zero overlap in the product markets, even though they are from the same industry, right? And so to correctly assess the rivalry between firms, what scholars are trying to posit is that Samsung is probably a more viable competitor of Apple just because they have products in similar ranges across different verticals. And so when you start clustering or use clustering, then you're possibly going to get a cluster that is composed of Apple, Samsung, and Motorola or some similar companies, and then Freedom, etc., will be in a different kind of a cluster. So that's that. And last, but certainly not the least, these are overall network properties. They tend to be used in all fields. Even when we use centrality measures, we do a lot of robustness checks, because when you are studying the impact of, let's say, one network variable on an outcome, and it is endogenously changed by, say, certain internal dynamics within the network, then all of the analysis you do might not be correct, right? And so you want some stability in the network dynamics itself. You don't want a lot of endogeneity. And so that's where we use a lot of these overall network properties here. Now, these network properties, I've mentioned a couple of examples. They might be like diameter, like at the farthest end, if we took two individuals within a network that are maximally disconnected to each other, and obviously that means that it takes the most number of steps in order to reach them. In that Microsoft example that I gave you, where they analyzed 30 billion emails, that number was 29. So they found that any two individuals who had ever used their email could be connected in a maximum of 29 steps. 29 steps sounds less, it is a lot. Like, just imagine like you reaching out to someone, that person reaching out to someone, and like that circle cascades. And so that number is 29, but it is not an infinite number, and that's the good news. So that would be the diameter of that network if you ended up calculating that. An average path length is simply, on an average, how many steps do we need to connect two people on Earth, right? In that example that I gave you in the Milgram experiment, that was 6. In the Microsoft example, it was 6.6. The Microsoft researchers have done the experiment again, and it's close to 7 now. Now, one thing I wanted to highlight here was that a lot of the times we have a lot of network scholars using standard regression techniques. And this is something that I typically don't talk about in the first session of social networks, but because I'm only going to have one session with you, I do want to talk about it. So you have to be a little bit careful, right? Social networks are interesting. I have combined it with standard regression techniques a lot, but it will have to be extremely deft in combining the two, because the standard properties that you use for regression techniques do not apply similarly to the network concepts, right? And why is that? The reason being, a lot of the natural network systems, and I'm not talking about artificially generated networks, a lot of which are there today. If we talk about a national network of human interaction at IIM Ranchi, or like how are the electricity grids across India distributed, or how is the railway network in India distributed, they tend to follow the power law. And what is this power law? This power law is based on the principle of preferential attachment, right? Let's say you go on Facebook and you want to send a friend request to someone, and you have 5 different people that you can send a friend request to. One has 1 connection, one has 2 connections, one has 3, one has 4, and one has 5 connections. You're most likely going to send that friend request first to the individual with 5 connections, right? And that is the principle of preferential attachment, which is to say that mature nodes, or the larger nodes, or the more popular nodes, tend to have a higher degree or higher likelihood of attracting a new connection than nodes with fewer connections, right? And so it is also, in some words, known as the Matthew effect, where it is a quote from the Bible, where which I don't know, and I don't want to misquote Bible, but it derives its name from the Bible, which basically means rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So that concept. So that is what is reflected in this power law distribution. Now, as you can see, this power law distribution looks nothing like the normal distribution that we use typically in regression techniques, right? Which tends to follow a normal curve. And for this normal curve, and that can also occur if you had a network with random distribution of nodes and edges, something like the bottom figure, but most networks look like the figure above, right? So some nodes will have a lot of connections and some nodes will have no connections at all. It is also known as a fat tail distribution or a heavy tail distribution. And so you have to be a little bit cognizant that every time you use a network measure, you visualize it properly and check its kernel density, so on and so forth. I'm happy to take technical questions after. And then you apply a regression technique that is appropriate to it. So this is something I really want to highlight, right? So now I'm going to talk about some examples of how I have applied social networks in my research. I could take any other paper, but it's easiest to talk about your own papers. So I had this paper published in the Global Strategy Journal in the October of 2022. In this paper, we're looking at how the foreign direct investment is routed through different tax havens, right? And tax havens is basically a term used to denote countries that have very low tax rates, right? So an effective tax rate for businesses in India is somewhere 30%, right? So some countries will have like 0% tax. Now imagine if you are earning 100 rupees and you are like putting like 30 bucks on the table for the government, like you're gonna cringe. You'll be like, oh my god, if I had this 30 bucks more, I could do so much more for my business, right? And so that is one incentive firms have to use tax havens, because, and it is, so basically what I'm trying to say is it's not always about tax evasion. Like that is also obviously one thing, but tax havens, because of their extremely low tax rates, tend to give you more money as a business to invest on risky projects and activities. And so how did I use networks here, right? Let's see. So for the longest time, we knew that, okay, sorry, there's a little bit of lag. So basically, we always knew that multinational companies do use tax havens. Even Apple, for the longest time, was headquartered in Ireland, not in the US, but in Ireland, right? A lot of the Indian companies, like the big ones, I know definitely for Flipkart, but I'm sure it will be true for a lot of other companies, are not headquartered in India. They are headquartered in Singapore. Right? So Singapore has a very low tax rate. It is a very well functioning machinery for financial work or bookkeeping and things like that. Any financial disputes are resolved extremely quickly. And so all of these are benefits for businesses, right? In India, what ends up happening a lot of the times is that if you run into a financial dispute, this dispute can last several years, right? So with that mindset, we know that MNEs often do not have their headquarters in their home countries, right? They go to different tax havens where they are not adding any value because they're not conducting any economic activity. And then because they're not adding any value, then is it all a bad picture of like, the home country losing out at that revenue and the host country benefiting nothing and everything being appropriated by the MNE? Is that what it is? But if that were so, then all the countries in the world will really clamp down really, really hard on tax havens, right? And they will not allow these tax havens to persist or even exist, right? And so there has to be some rationale why tax havens continue to exist in the world, right? And what we also want to figure out is that when home countries want to clamp down on you going to a tax haven, how effectively can they do that? If everyone only goes to one tax haven in one step, then it's very easy to do. You have a bilateral agreement that forbids any company from your country to have headquartered in that other country, which has a really low tax rate, right? But if this increases to 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, or 5 steps, which is a more realistic scenario because MNEs reroute their investments multiple times, then how does it affect the home country and the host country, right? So the broad question we wanted to ask was that how does this dispersion of increasing number of steps in which companies are using tax havens impacting productivity, right? Is it like no productivity gain at all, which basically means that they're just hopping jurisdictions to sort of save money, or is there anything to it, like, which is why tax havens persist in the first place? This was a core question, right? Now, remember, one thing that I am building my identity in the US around is a lot of the research on foreign direct investment was conducted at the bilateral level. So we only talked about the home country and then the host country. Home country is the country of the MNE to which it belongs, like Apple's home country would be US, and then host country is where it's investing. Right? It can be India, Singapore, China, any other country. And that's all. But a lot of the times, when you think about it, companies don't invest in only one country, they invest in multiple countries, right? So how do you talk about those relationships at the same time? Because if you have a home host context, you can only talk about India and US at the time. What about you wanting to talk about all the countries in which all the US companies are investing in? For that, you need network analysis. So this is my identity. I'm trying to shift the conversation within the foreign direct investment literature from a simple dyadic relationship of home and host to a broader level, like a multilateral world where we are talking about all the people we are connected with at the same time, which is what social network analysis gives us the power to do. So what happens when you do network analysis of FDI in tax havens? You find that MNEs use tax haven countries as financial intermediaries, and it is not a small amount because, as you can see, about 40% of foreign direct investments globally is routed through tax havens, and this is disclosed data, right? A lot of the rerouting that happens is also not disclosed, so the actual number is much higher than this 40% that I've depicted here. And like I just said, like, it is not always only about tax arbitrage opportunities. It's not just about saving money, and it is also about capital efficiency. For example, Singapore is more capital efficient than India, right? They have well-developed financial systems. They have a better intellectual property regime. They have a better jurisdiction, faster resolution of a dispute, and so on and so forth. So we have to have that conversation. And then we have this another reason, which is to say that so the third thing we want to talk about is that when MNEs go to tax havens, let's say you've already established a subsidiary in Singapore, then can you establish a subsidiary in Vietnam? Probably not, right? Because you've already had a subsidiary in Singapore and so on and so forth. So you need to visualize it collectively, because once you have a relationship, it either makes it easier to create a new relationship or it makes it more difficult. Now imagine I am talking to a person who's really unpopular in my school. And so if we are friends, even though I'm an extremely nice person, which I am, by the way, people will not be wanting to be friends with me because they will start associating me with this really unpleasant other person who just doesn't talk that well with other person. On the other hand, even though I'm a really unpleasant personality, I'm terrible, I have a short temper. You say hi, I'm like, what's up? And you're like, to hell with you. And you don't want to talk to me directly, but let's say a really nice person that everyone knows in the school becomes friends with me. So even though I'm an unpleasant person, it gives me a personality that I might be okay because this person has chosen to talk to me, right? So this is a really interesting concept, like, which is to say that once you look at the relationships you do have, it shapes what other relationships you can have, right? The next set of relationships that you're trying to force. And so the same thing happens in the context of countries also. Let's say if you have India and China at war, and there is a war going on right now between Russia and Ukraine. And so there are like camps, right? So if you're friends with Ukraine, you're very unlikely to be friends with Russia. And if you're friends with Russia, you're very unlikely to be friends with anyone in the world because, well, most sympathies are with Ukraine right now. So that's how things work in real life, right? And so if you want to also take into account that possibility, then you still need networks, because then you can factor in for the relationship networks that you already have, and then you can see like what happens next. I'll quickly go to the in the interest of time, this is the network analysis we did. You can also find it in my paper. And again, these are the really big tax havens, the marked ones. Luxembourg is a huge tax haven in the US. Switzerland, did any of you think Switzerland was a tax haven? Possibly not, right? And yet, Switzerland is a tax haven, a very prominent one. Mauritius is actually a very big tax haven, very close to India. It is another place a lot of Indian companies go to headquarter themselves. And so I have a different measure here, and we can talk about if everyone is interested in it later on. And so we did this network analysis, and then we have like a bunch of theory where we look at if you have a tie, if you are an M&E from a country which has a lot of ties in the tax haven, then how does it impact the productivity? Let's say a lot of companies from India are going to Mauritius and Singapore, vis-a-vis, let's say they are going to British Virgin Islands, which is another tax haven. How does it impact India's productivity? And we find that if you are going to tax havens like Singapore and Luxembourg, then you're positively impacting India's GDP, which is so counterintuitive, right? But on the other hand, if you're going to a tax haven like British Virgin Islands or some similar like unknown country in the world, like Cyprus maybe, or Bahamas is a really big one. Then we find that it impacts India's GDP negatively. So basically, what we find is that if your companies are using a prominent tax haven, then it helps you. But if your companies are using a tax haven to hide money, which is the case with the smaller ones, then you're probably losing out on productivity. I'll give you another example of a paper that came out recently. I want to focus more on that, which is why I went over the slides really quickly. This just came out in JIBS in August this year. And what we find in what we were asking in this is that a very classic question in foreign direct investment. So Indian government is really courting a lot of international investors right now, right? Come and invest in India. You have Narendra Modi, who has really turbocharged this thing. They come invest in India. He has these really big seminars, like we just had the G20 summit in Delhi that concluded a few months ago. So we have like this insane focus right now on attracting foreign investors in India. And what is the hope? Why do countries spend so much money, spend so much time and so much energy inviting all these foreign investors to the country, right? And you might think, if you are not very familiar with the context, is that it is about money, right? Unfortunately, it is not, right? Initially, when these foreign companies come to a country, they have to be given preferential tax treatments, right? So you have to be given subsidies, tax breaks, things to attract them. In that case, you're probably losing money, right? When you're inviting people from these different countries. And still, we're doing all of that effort, right, to invite those countries into our home context. So the second thought is probably it is not about money, which we know it is not, because initially we're losing money when inviting these people over. But then you think like maybe they are adding value in different ways. They're bringing something that we don't have already. For example, like Anand Ranji spent a lot of money bringing me in and other really more esteemed guests than me here. And why was that? I'm like a huge resource drain for you because I'm not paying you anything, and I'm probably not going to impact anything economic in I'm Ranchi directly. But what I possibly can do and contribute to it is shaping your thoughts, right? And you possibly never thought that networks could be that interesting, and you could use it in your research. And so that is called a knowledge spillover, right? So I've shaped your mindset. And even though it is not directly benefiting you right now, but because I've shaped it in a certain way, then let's say research productivity at IIM Ranchi increases in the long run. And so even though immediately they're not winning, they are winning in the long run, right? By you becoming the turbocharged people producing a lot of research on social network analysis, right? And so that's the same thought with the countries and companies also. When India invites Apple to its shores and it gives it a tax break or something like that, it is not just directly about employing local people, but also upskilling them. Because you're working at the Apple factory, you learn a lot of things. And so this trained manpower might leave Apple eventually and go on to work with local companies and then do really good work. A lot of our engineers were trained that way, right? So today India is one of the leading producers of knowledge in the world, not just engineering but otherwise. And I'm very proud of that fact. If you look at any of the technical companies in the US, a bunch of them have Indian CEOs. We've really proved our mettle there. And what is India gaining from all of this branding that has happened? It is coming back to the shores, right? Some of our people are coming back home. They're starting very interesting companies that are doing really, really well, right? So we wouldn't have known about this whole supercharged world that exists out there if we had always been within the boundaries of our country, right? Which is why you also travel internationally sometimes, right? You see interesting things elsewhere and then you bring it back to the country. So that is knowledge spillover for you. And so in this conversation, we were talking about spillovers. And how is spillover defined typically? Now, spillover is defined in a very peculiar way, right? And so let's say I am interacting with one of you. And what is a spillover? A spillover is that my interaction with you doesn't impact you directly, but everyone else who is witnessing this interaction somehow gains from it, right? And so Apple starts a factory in India. It has a very innovative way of doing things. And even though that location where it started that company is not, let's say, benefiting a lot, but the other companies in different locations benefiting in the sense that they observe what Apple is doing in this location and then they are carrying that knowledge there. Right? But if you have only this home host, this dyadic interaction there, if you're only looking at Apple in this location, then you lose out on all the benefits there is in all the other locations, right? And so to do that effectively, you need to do network analysis. And when we went in, we just thought it was a naive debate, but we ended up getting a lot of awards and a lot of traction for this paper because this core debate, which is that does inward FDI benefit economic growth, has persisted for decades, like 50 years. And different scholars have tried to bring different angles to it. Some scholars have said that, well, inward foreign direct investment helps the host country, which is why countries fight to bring in all these foreign investors. But sometimes we see negative effects because the host country is not equipped to basically absorb that knowledge. Let's say you have all this knowledge in India coming through, but we don't have local engineers to implement it until unless they are working in Apple, then it's not very helpful at all, right? So we need to have other talent that can absorb these spillovers to do that. Some try to explain by saying that, well, the whole measure of like economic activity through foreign direct investment cannot be measured. It is very difficult to measure that. And so we are never able to resolve this debate. And let's just live with this ambiguity that we don't know. Like, does it help or does it not help? We don't know. And we don't want to know because this is an irresolvable paradox. Some scholars also try to say that it is where the country is in its stage of development, right? Or where the inward FDI is coming. Let's say if a company is coming to India with the sole motive of employing really low cost workers, then they're probably not going to locate high value activities here. And so that FDI is called extractive in nature. They're just wanting to take something from you without giving you anything in return, which is why we don't observe any positive effect. On the other hand, if the company is coming here with the intention of developing the local workforce in a certain way that benefits it, then possibly we are going to see positive effect. And we heard all of these debates, and we said that there is another reason that this resolution has not been resolved, which is to say that you're trying to measure a multilateral phenomenon with a bilateral analysis, right? And so you're wanting to ask the question where Ram and Sita are interacting with each other, and how does it impact the citizens of Ayodhya. And you're only focusing on Ram and Sita. You never go and talk to people of Ayodhya, then you're never going to learn about them, like, or how it has impacted them. You're just theorizing that, oh yeah, they might have seen this interaction and they must have felt this way and they must behave that way and things like that. And so you want to change that. And so to do that, you have to also study people of Ayodhya, right? Instead of just focusing on Ram and Sita. And so that's basically this paper is about. We use network analysis in this paper, and we show that when we have inward foreign direct investment coming from multiple partners, which is what Prime Minister Modi is trying to do, it really helps the host country because it gives you a really interesting perspective on what else is happening in different countries in the world, right? And similarly, if you have investors that are themselves very well connected in the world, let's say if you have an investor like US and then you have an option of inviting an investor like Somalia, then you'll probably favor US because US is well connected, they have very high knowledge, they have very efficient resource utilization, so on and so forth, right? And so we are basically trying to say that this resolution of debate also comes from the analysis you use, and the practical implication of which is that countries should focus on multiple investors instead of relying on only one or two big investors, and countries should prioritize well-connected investors over less connected investors. So so that's it. This is some examples of network visualization from the paper. But now I would like to take any questions you might have. Yes. Okay, yeah. So in my paper, the second one? Okay. So in this JIPS paper, we used two different measures. One was quality and one was quality. So what I have here is diversity of ties, which basically is that how many different number of countries are investing in you, right? And so if we look at India, which is here at the bottom, you see that India is inviting people from different contexts in the sense that you have countries like Nepal, you can barely see it. You have Cambodia, you can barely see it. You have Jordan, which is very small. Hong Kong, by the way, is a huge FDI destination, but it is really small because it only invites FDI from like a very few countries, which is like China, US, UK, and so on and so forth. So literally just counting how many countries are represented in the investor profiles of the countries that you have, right? And this was the diversity of ties. The second measure in the paper is quality of ties, and that is measured through IM vector centrality. And what it does is that it weighs the investments received from a country like United States, which is really huge here, higher than investments from, say, Bulgaria, which is really small, which is comparatively smaller than United States. So if you have $100 coming from both places, in the analysis, it will value $100 coming from United States much more than the $100 coming from Bulgaria, right? And in that sense, it helps you distinguish between the quality of FDI coming in. So sometimes it's not just about the money, but who is bringing in that money, right? So that was the intention for the second measure. So there is an algorithm that takes care of it. You assign weights. You can also assign weights, right? So in that sense, it will be called monastic centrality. In this case, the weight is positive. We are assuming that if you are a more connected country like United States, then your FDI is more valuable. Let's say it was the reverse. Right? If you are a country like United States, then we assume it's less valuable because let's say they will have all the power, they will extract everything from our country and they'll give nothing in return, right? In that sense, you would want to assign a weight that is negative. You would want to downweigh the investments received from the United States and upweigh the investments received from Bulgaria. And so you can give it a negative weight also. But the algorithm does it for you. And obviously you have to rely on contextual work in the field before to basically say it's going to be positive or negative. But yes, you can assign weights partially, and partially it's done by the algorithms. Yes, I would suggest you read work by Borgatti. Borgatti's book. It came out in 2002 or 2006. In addition to that, well, I don't use UCINet anymore. I use R because object-oriented programming. I write a script and you can use it multiple times. UCINet is clickbait, so you have to do click, click, click analysis, which means it's not reproducible. It's a great way to start on social network analysis. And so there is an online compendium by Hanneman, Hanneman, and it has a lot of these measures explained therein. So it is a primer to using UCINet, and then obviously it also explains all the measures there. So that would be another good place. Yes.
So my question is, are these lines straight always?
As in like the line straight always in what sense? This
For
is
example, so in a family, so we have husband and wife.
Yeah.
When mother tries to interfere, in the line the connectivity, it get extended.
Got it.
So I hope different countries, they have different magnetic powers.
Yes.
So these lines are not the straight lines; these are just like your magnetic lines.
Right. So in the context of network analysis, we call it brokerage, right? So basically, let's say you, how is it brokerage basically, right? So your wife tells you something and your mom tells you something and they don't talk to each other, right? So you can practically shape any interaction between your mother and your wife because you can choose to tell them things that they have said about each other. Let's say they are fighting with each other, but you instead go and tell each other, she was saying all these really nice things about you. And your wife will be like, well, she doesn't seem to like me very much, but if he's saying she likes me, maybe there's like an undertone. And so tomorrow when she brings tea, she'll be like extra nice to your mother-in-law, right?
Is there any mathematical regression line that can help us to know more about these relations?
So that is not regression again. That would be network, and you would use betweenness centrality, which is a measure of brokerage. Yeah. And it is precisely the concept that you can shape interaction because you have power, because you control the flow of information between those two people.
Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you very much for this amazing presentations. I have just one query that specifically, as I'm a operations research guy.
Yeah.
So my query is that is it something related to based on the graph theories, with all the connected things?
Yes. It is based on graph theory. Eddos Renyi is possibly known as the father of social networks, and you might know about the Renyi number. Eddos Renyi worked on random graph and graph properties, and so yes.
So Baker number is almost similar to that Eddos number.
Yes, the Baker number is the exact same as Erdos number.
And another thing is, you have told this weighted in degree centrality.
Yeah.
These weights are pre-assigned or like in the constant optimization. We have seen that sometimes if you give the specific constant that okay, all the sum of the weights will be 1. So in such a way, weights are pre-assigned or it is generated through your prescriptor.
So this is unconstrained optimization. So there are no constraints, and the weights are assigned based on the actual flows between the countries. So how much money they're investing in. So we are trying to. So let's say you have US investing in India, and if we just count US and let's say Bulgaria and let's say France, some of these countries number-wise, a simple unweighted, let's say. And US is huge, but it's only investing $100 in India, which is like nothing, right? And France is investing millions of dollars. Then no matter how much I talk about the diversity of connections. France is a more important strategic partner for you, and they are really invested in you and interested in you. So you have to control for that quantitative effect of like absolute money to disentangle the qualitative aspects like diversity and quality. So that's why we use weighted, and the weights here are the actual investments between countries. But weights can be different contexts. It can be different. Like you can weight how many number of times people have interacted with each other and things like that. Yeah.
I have a question. I want to ask, can this be done using spatial econometrics?
Spatial econometrics. So spatial econometrics is a different kind of field, I would say. And there's a really interesting paper by a friend of mine, actually. I'm not sure I can call him a friend. He's very senior to me, but Ari Van Ash, and Ekaterina Turkina. And so they use spatial econometrics to study the airline industry and the clustering within. Now, the thing about the spatial econometrics and how social network is different from each other is it is really about the space. It is really, really about the space, right? And it is location based. Where our social network is more conceptual. It's more one aspect of it, like what you can study with spatial econometrics can sometimes be studied with social networks, but not vice versa, right? So there are different techniques, and they are used to achieve different purposes. They also call it network in the sense because it is a spatial network, but it is a constrained network.
Okay, I have few more questions related. Like, I mean, is there any measure of this connectivity, or like, for example, in FDI there is a concept of agglomeration, which also captures some sort of connectivity only.
Yes.
So, I mean, I would like to know if there is any measure or any other way of capturing this connectivity between the countries.
Okay, that was my dissertation, by the way, disentangling agglomeration from competitive effects.
Like I'm actually working in that area, and I
Okay.
would.
Nice
I mean,
to know.
that's why I'm asking.
Right. So I can confirm it because I did my whole PhD in it. In the context of the automobile industry, there is a huge difference between agglomeration and any other kind of network. So agglomeration is a very specific kind of network in that firms located in that location are connected to each other. And so it is based on exchange of quasi-public goods. So if you are present in the location, then the resources in that location are accessible to you. If you're not located in that location, they're not accessible to you. And besides that, what ends up happening in agglomeration is also that it is non-exclusionary in nature, right? So basically, if there is a human resource pool there, then you can have non-compete agreements, but in the US at least, like they are almost on the decline. Like all the governments are wanting to ban those non-compete agreements. And so if you remove those special circumstances, then as long as you're in that location, no one can prevent you from using those resources, right? Those resources are free to work with you or not. Now, there are other kinds of networks that exist, and I look at one of them specifically, which is like the competition network. So to the first question, yes, agglomeration is a kind of social network, but not all social networks are agglomeration. So that's the answer to the first question. And the second question, I would say that different networks will have different exchange dynamics, and which is what I was getting at in the first example. In agglomeration, the exchange is almost always positive because you are exchanging quasi-public goods, which do not have diminishing returns, right? So if you have like multiple companies located in one location, the quality of human capital in that location only goes on increasing and increasing. It doesn't decrease, right? However, if you have a common scientist, that scientist can only work for one company at a time, right? And so when you're exchanging private goods, which tends to be the case in, let's say, in the competition network that I studied to contrast it with agglomeration, then you have a completely different dynamic. And so you have to really understand the different networks in order to understand how they're going to affect the firms. In agglomeration, it's only going to be positive. In competition, it's going to be negative. I don't know. I think I said a lot, but I don't know if that answered your question.
No, actually it does. And one more thing I want was, does this method incorporate the distance thing that we have in international business literature, the different forms of distance, not just physical?
You can, obviously. So, just like in this example, I'm weighing the edges by the amount of investment between two countries. In agglomeration, you can weigh the distances, like weigh it by distances between the plans of two different companies. But I think I'm not weighing it in my context because I'm basically just contrasting location bound versus non-location bound networks. So for me, like it really depends on the resource question. Yes, you can use weights there, which will be like the actual distances used in agglomeration or spatial econometrics. But you can also not use them. Like I'm not using them because my conceptual question doesn't need it.
Okay. Anyway, very interesting study. I would like to.
Thank you. I think I need to use this one though.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah.
As my PhD work is also on the interconnectedness of global financial market and volatility spillover.
So you like the first paper then?
Yes, actually, ma'am, when I was referring the review of literature, I found many papers has done on like TVP bar, quantile bar, such kind of regression analysis has been carried out.
Yeah.
So based on that, I have also done a paper with TVP bar. So my question is how far this centrality measurement is. I just want to know whether which one will be better for measuring the connectedness.
So it really depends on the distribution that you obtain after you do the network analysis. So for example, in the context of this paper, like this JIPS paper, we have robust regressions, right? And the reason we use robust regression is that we have a really fact-tailored distribution that I talked about earlier, in which you have United States contributing 40% to the global FDI flows in the world, right? So either it is mediated through it or its companies are actually investing in it. And so if I use standard regression, then it is an outlier. Either have to trim it, or if I use Winsorization, again, it will be in some sort of the way, some other way of like getting rid of it. And if you get rid of USA, then what are you studying? Right? You're effectively excluding 40% of your sample. And so your analysis is biased, right? And so robust regression actually uses all the outliers, all the information that is available with outliers in it. And so we ended up using robust regressions. In some cases, you will have like a bimodal distribution of like the network measures you end up calculating. In that sense, it might be more helpful to do quantile regressions or rich discontinuity designs, because you can have different regression lines for different intervals. And so irrespective of like the topography of the actual distribution, you can basically estimate lines within like fixed intervals where you can say something definitively about the distribution. So you visualize it is what I'm going to say, which is what I was trying to get at with network visualization. In most of the contexts, central limit theorem holds, and so you blindly basically assume like as long as I have a decent number of sample, like a big sample, I'm good with using standard regression techniques. But in networks, you cannot make that assumption. You really have to visualize it. And so I would encourage you to use kernel density graphs to see like how the distribution looks like and what is the right regression technique for it.
Is there any other measurement than the centrality, ma'am?
So centrality in itself is huge, right? So I will use one word, centrality, but centrality can be PageRank centrality, closeness centrality, fragmentation centrality, degree centrality, eigenvector centrality, betweenness centrality, like I can go on. And so every centrality measure goes on to capture a very different network dynamic. The common thing about centrality though is it is always about the properties of the individual nodes within the broader network, right? And so the rest of the things that we talked about, they are all at the network level. Like connectedness is about the whole network, or the diameter is about the whole network. But centrality measures are about the individual properties or the structural properties of individual nodes within the bigger network.
So can I ask you one more question, ma'am?
Happy to answer any number of questions.
So can we compare different crises with this measurement, ma'am? Like how this connectedness been in one crisis period and how it is has been connected in another crisis period. Can we compare with the centrality, ma'am?
So crises are interesting in the sense that you're basically using event discontinuity design, right? So event studies to be more precise. Now, event studies are typically like what I would suggest you to do is that you can always look at a definitive interval before and after the crisis, one, and then before and after the crisis two, and that is definitely a way of studying it. But like you do the analysis and you will get at it. I have a paper which we are working on. It is on board networks in India, and we are using this Companies Act 2013 as an intervention or not a crisis period, and we see like network properties change drastically. And based on what you said, is like, do different network measures respond differently? Possibly that, right? We do find that. So we find that the degree centrality responds in a very different way than eigenvector centrality. So the acts specifically banned directors from serving on more than like 5 or 10 boards. And so we see like a drastic decrease in the degree centrality, and it is like a stable decrease, like it continues to be low afterwards. And we see like there is like a very slight dip in the eigenvector centrality, and then there's like a huge jump, and that jump persists again, right? And I'm happy to take more questions. We have a reason of why this happens, but you're right. Different network properties will respond, may or may not, actually, that you'll have to see differently to different crises.
Thank you, ma'am.
I guess we can wrap it up here, right? Is there any other question? Okay, so with this, I would like to sincerely thank you for coming over. And the session was really insightful and highly engaging. I'm sure that all of us have taken away something from your presentation.
Thank you.
So with that, I would also like to invite all of you for the lunch. So we are having lunch in the mess today. We'll be moving there shortly. Okay, so with that, we'll wrap up this morning session of doctoral colloquium. See you after the lunch. So we'll be having 2 more sessions. So looking forward to seeing all of you in the second half as well. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming in. Yeah, it was really fun to meet you all.
Say, are you singing? I know I